Conway Hall, London, where ethics matter.
So now we're going to talk about a stake in the landscape. Jeremy Harte. Is Jeremy here? He is indeed. Fantastic. Come up, Jeremy. It's about crossroads burial in history and legend. Until 1923, it was the law that suicides should be buried in public disgrace, their bodies shovelled under the roadway and pierced with wooden stakes. And even at the time, this kind of humanity did look baffling to most. Jeremy Harte is a researcher in folklore and archaeology with a particular interest in landscape legends and tales of encounters with the inhabitants of other worlds. He's the curator of Bourne Hall Museum in Surrey, and he has written several things, including Explore Fairy Traditions was the winner of a Katharine Briggs Award, very prestigious. So welcome to Jeremy.
They buried her at midnight in the crossroads with a stake through her heart. And it sounds fairy tale, you know, it sounds like the conclusion of the bad news in Snow White. It's real, it happened near you. London example, the parish records for Aldgate, very comprehensive, record about one disgraceful suicide burial every 15 years. Amy Stokes hangs herself. She's 60, it's 1590. There's no poor relief. She's at the end of her tether. They see her first thing in the morning. Within 12 hours, they've taken her out. They've found a place near where the old cross used to be. Remember, this is Protestant, post-Catholic England, still littered with monuments of the old religion. At 9 o'clock, which was pretty late at night in those days, they've buried her just beyond Barrows Corner and hammered the stake through her heart, leaving it as a monument of disgrace and infamy, the parish register goes out of its way to tell us, so that nobody shall be tempted to perform the like deed ever after again. So obviously, like if it's a monument, it's sticking up in the middle of the road. And this continues to be the ritual, the civic ritual, if you like, of crossroads burial, right through until, as Deborah says, 1823, when it was closed by Act of Parliament. So in civilised Georgian London, they are still going out, setting up the necessary impedimenta. The Ratcliffe Highway murderer, James Williams, who in 1811 succeeded in wiping out all of his fellow lodgers by the dexterous use of a shipwright's mallet, and then cut his throat in jail when he realised he didn't want to make a public appearance of himself on the gallows, nevertheless found himself, though not consciously, appearing in public, bundled up on a cart. I mean, there's like, you know, contemporary sketches, neatly laid out, with the murder weapon next to him, with the stake above his head, and with the shovel next to him so they could go and dig a hole. And they took him along to the Cable Street crossroads, and again, the hole is dug. They use the shipwright's mallet that he'd employed for the murder, and they hammer through the stake with a large crowd watching. As Mark said earlier, dark tourism has a long history. And the stake remains. Obviously, you know, by this stage, you look at the picture, they had to allow for the fact it was getting in the way of traffic. So London, by this stage, is kind of bundling people out of the way. In smaller places, it remained as a public monument. In the 1810s in South Shields, a baker hangs himself. He is buried in the highway, following the normal rituals. And it's remembered in the 1880s because the stake was left lying about a foot above the ground, sticking up there. And it was a big local kids thing that when they were playing I'm the King of the Castle, one of the boys would balance on top of it, and the others would try to dislodge him. So it's become part of the accepted idea of how life is. And yet, at the process of increasing civilization, they're concerned, is this the right way to treat people? There's kind of two currents here. One is actually humanitarian. Attitudes towards suicide are changing. This kind of ritual is imposed very widely by Elizabethan authorities as a means of imparting religious messages. Suicide is the absolute desolation. It's giving up on your hope of heaven. It's rejecting Christianity. The people who reject must themselves be publicly rejected in order to teach the others. And as the idea of personal anguish, difficulties emerges, so juries are less likely to impose the original verdict, which was almost standard throughout the 16th, 17th century, which is fellow to say. A suicide is not an unfortunate person. A suicide is a murderer whose victim happens to be themselves, and the lodgers in the case of the Ratcliffe Highway. So the softer verdict is to announce that it happened during a temporary fit of insanity. And what pushes its way through in the 18th century is that insanity becomes a distinguishing feature of upper-class suicides. When Lord Castlereagh cuts his throat, shortly after Congress of Vienna, everybody simply goes, poor chap, temporary fit of absence of mind, and he has a churchyard funeral. When the working classes cut their throats, they still get the full treatment. And this is actually flagged up in the literature. There's a lovely passage in Fielding's Tom Jones. Sophia, the heroine, has had her difficulties in love, and because this is like in the romantic movement, she's going, oh, I feel like ending it all. And up comes her maid Honor and says, oh, ma'am, you don't want to do that. You don't want to end it all like that. Oh, look at Farmer Tom that did that, and he was buried in Ox Crossroads with a stake through his heart. And the whole vulgarity, as it's perceived, of the ordinary churchyard burial pushes aside her noble, distinguished romantic talk of self-ending. And this is the way progress works. Alas, in some respects, people get a bit more humanitarian, but basically, usually by the time stuff gets associated with the working classes, it's deemed as being naff, and it's finally pushed out of the social register altogether. And you're thinking, of course, within a short period of 1823, after it was abolished, people were wrestling with the idea, how on earth did we ever get to this state of things in the first place? So explanations are pushed for. Now, in terms of its cultural significance, the degrading rituals of suicide burial are explicitly a piece of pushed by local government and designed only to show how contemptible a suicide is. That's what they're for, what they're deemed to be for. And yet, when you actually think about this, the practical logistics, when they were burying Williams, they had to, obviously he's buried in his ordinary clothes, which are only just about covering him. They bundle him up in a bit of matting because they've got to hammer a stake into a human body and it's going to make a lot of mess. Why are they doing this? Literally, why are they getting medieval with his arse? And the explanation is indeed that this language has been taken from a series of medieval customs. Because we find in the earlier literature that, yes, the excluding burial is already present as a thing that you do. When Earl Godwin, at least in the later versions, choked on a piece of bread after he'd sworn a false oath, King Edward the Confessor, who must know about these things, shouts, take aside this dog and this traitor and bury him at the crossroads, for he is not worthy of Christian sepulture. Parenthetically, in one of the romances, the romance of Tristan, where he's he's toddling off to meet Isolde, and it's let's meet each other at the Red Cross. And the poem just says, and they meet at the Red Cross, where many a corpse is buried, like that's the normal thing that happens at crossroads. It's assumed that you will have people, but they're not necessarily suicides. In fact, paradoxically, the medieval church, about which we hear the odd bad thing, was far more inclusive about people who had killed themselves, and much more inclined to give them the benefit of the spiritual doubt than the Puritan church. What you find, however, is that the exclusion in the earlier records is focused predominantly on these people who have actually pushed themselves outside of the community, but by treachery. And you've got to remember that Fellow, in the verdict of Fellow to say that these courts were issuing out, actually means traitor. And this goes back to deep assumptions in English law, that you've got two classes of crime. You've got misdemeanors, where you can be tried in the local court because you pissed off your neighbours. But you've got felonies, where you have offended against the peace of the Lord King, and even now you get tried in a Crown court. So crime, including the crime of self-murder, is regarded as a kind of subsection of treachery. And because the traitor has acted against society, the traitor is alienated from society. And you push them out. In 1309, in Cheshire, I've got my first record where not only are they announcing that, in this case, an execution victim, so probably therefore somebody convicted of a capital crime, not necessarily a suicide, is to be buried at a crossroads, but also a place where three parishes meet. And again, this is the intersection between law and folklore, because although the legal arrangements, and there's books that instruct you how to act as a country justice, will be saying, yes, must be buried in the highway, however you interpret that. And usually, sometimes they specify the stake. Sometimes, like if it's a really, really appalling murder plus suicide, it's 2 stakes. Because they're dead. I mean, what else can you do to them? It's like, double the infamy. But they never specify the boundaries. That is literally folk in the sense that it's passed down as an oral tradition from at least the 14th century, right up not only to 1823, but also, as we get to find out, into the way these things are interpreted later. Now, there is a long tradition from high Victorian folkloristics which shakes its head and says, oh, this stake thing, it's not just to mark, obviously, like you're treating the dead body as a thing, completely opposite to kind of the funeral practices we've been talking about, in which the dead person remains a person. You're deliberately depersonalizing them, trampling on them, breaking up their body. But is it to exorcise the spirit of the dead man? And this is the difference, if you like, between contemporary and survivalistic folkloristics. That if you're looking at it in a contemporary sense, it is quite obvious that no, from 1590 onwards, it's not anything to do with ghosts. They're not talking about that. On the other hand, historically, there's no doubt that the idea of the stake does come from medieval stuff, which was about controlling the spirits. In Burkhardt's Curator, German, but similar traditions, he's complaining about people who treat unbaptized children. Unbaptized children are, they're not suicides, they're not traitors, but by God, they're outside the Christian community, and you've got to push them away. So they're buried in the fields with a stake banged through them to stop them coming back. In rural Sweden, which, pre-Volvo was very, very hard to get to in the winter, you've got these coastal communities where no priest can actually access the dead, where the dead have to be buried, and again, they put a stake into him, so that the dead are confined. And then when the priest eventually turns up in the summer, they pull the stake out and they put the sacraments into the hole so that it's all right retrospectively. So the stake custom was available in the vocabulary of what can be done, but is transformed, from a ritual of tackling ghosts to a way of dealing with people that you're scared of, but not in a supernatural sense. You just don't like the idea of them being around. This raises the question, what happens when you get it wrong? Because verdicts, especially, like we saw in the case of Amy, they decided on the status in 12 hours. Not much time for alternative evidence to crop up. So already in the late medieval collection, there's a lovely one called The Alphabet of Tales, which tells you the improving story of a certain learned clerk who was accused of sorcery because he was too learned, and burnt as a sorcerer. Sorcery and heresy are obviously one for the purposes of this story, buried in the fields. A lot of the medieval stuff just isn't awfully worried about the roads. You've got to remember the medieval road system is not so defined. So it's not like there's 2 hedges and a highway. Anywhere outside the boundaries of the community is more or less open land. And then they find out that miracles are happening at the place where they've buried his remains. So it's like, so sorry. And they, build a church on the remains. And that's a fictional narrative. But we get the same sort of thing actually happening in 18th and 19th century. At Condive's Corner in Oxfordshire, a man was found hanging in the barn. Obviously, again, this is how suicide works, if you like, that people internalize what they imagine to be the judgment of society upon themselves, and that therefore, interestingly, men hang themselves, women drown themselves, both of which are methods of capital execution. You are committing execution upon yourself in that kind of mental state. So he's found hanging, and they take him down, they give him an immediate burial in the roadside, and then they find out that his neighbour murdered him and strung him up. So sorry. And they dig him up again and bury him in the churchyard. Now, you can see the rich opportunities for dispute here. There's nothing quite like an argument when a human body is the locus standi being pushed to and forth. In 1755, a London bookseller called Barrows, well, there's no doubt about what happens here, because he's one of those people who kind of abolishes their family at the same time. So he shoots his kid and shoots himself, obviously suicide, murderer, but his family are pushing for a verdict of insanity. He completely lost it and didn't know what he was doing. And so while they're getting ready to deliver the coroner's verdict, the family quietly sneak away with the body and are getting ready to have it buried somewhere out of harm's way. And the Lord Mayor then sends round the bailiffs to reclaim the body, demanding that it be buried in Moorfields, which it is. So you've got, again, this is pushing the boundaries of what we might call folklore. This is not popular custom asserting a brutal and undignified right in the face of authority. It's the other way round. Authority is demanding that we do this horrible thing to the guy, even though his family want a much more merciful attitude. On the other hand, there's a case from Hoyk, in which Jenny from Salthall cut her throat. Nevertheless, her husband pulls a few strings. She's buried in the churchyard, goes home, goes to bed alone. Well, that's all done. And next morning goes out to start a new life, and he can't kind of open the door. So pushes. And eventually, after a bit of pushing, there's a bang, and the door opens, and there's the coffin of his wife leaning up against the door because they've dug her up again. And he buries her again in the churchyard because he's a fairly firm-minded farmer. And again, they dig her up again, and next time he opens the door in the morning, there's his wife dug up again, waiting to be buried in the roadside. And eventually, he takes her out and buries her in the fields because that's the only way he can live with his neighbours. So there you've got the reverse kind of dispute where, the indignity is being insisted on by the folk, whereas authority, and the folk, staking isn't good enough for them. I haven't heard that, but I'm going to see it anytime soon in the newspapers. The case at Bristol, James Newton in 1735. Okay, James Newton trampled his pregnant wife to death. He is not going to receive an awful lot of sympathy from the authorities or from anybody else. They bury him in the roadside. Well and good. The public feel that that really wasn't enough, and in this case, they tear up his body out of the grave, pull him around, and tear him to bits and scatter him along the highway. So, clearly no concern here about potential haunting afterwards. What we do get, though, as after 1823, when this stuff starts to, make its way gradually, and this also raises all kinds of questions about folk history. How much can we rely on what people have to say in these contexts? If you are travelling in Dartmoor, having armed yourself with the appropriate guidebook available at the back, you will be asked to stop at Jay's grave, and the guide will stop and tell you that mysterious flowers there appear every year, and this is a tragic burial place of Kitty Jay, who was young and cute and had a boyfriend who wasn't young or cute. And when she got pregnant and he wasn't going to do anything about it, committed suicide. It's an old folk tradition, which goes all the way back to 1860. When they dug up some bones at the roadside, and basically the place was called Jay's Grave, so they said, who was it? And somebody said, well, I think it's a woman. For all we know, she might have been, eligible for, a senior person's rail card. But she becomes young because that's how you manipulate these stories. And Jay then becomes Mary Jay. Beatrice Chase, the Dartmoor author, then actually develops the story. And clearly, as far as anyone can work, Chase sneaked out early in the morning and started the tradition of laying down flowers. And when Chase dies, it's carried on locally because, let's face it, if coaches are stopping to look at the flowers, there must be flowers for them to look at. We know all about, firstly, she's Mary Jay, and then she metamorphoses into Kitty Jay because it sounds better. We know all about the story and about her life, because we have first-hand evidence. She actually appeared in past life regression, speaking through the voice of a Cheshire nurse and telling her tragic story, which is absolutely brilliant, until you find out that the story which she was telling was in fact taken verbatim from Lewis Deacon's novel An Angel at Your Door, which had picked this up, and it's yet another folklore into literature book. The Boy's Grave at Newmarket, where you're looking at a tradition current largely in the racing fraternity, that's going to be an example where there's a grave. Boy's grave is pretty vague. You need to actually think, okay, is this something that we ought to, get a story for? It becomes a shepherd boy. And he's terribly innocent because he lost one sheep and he was terrified of being taken up for having, failed to keep his duties, so he commits suicide. It's a tragic structure. And what's happening, of course, is the real tragedy of suicide, which is enormously messy and complicated, has been reduced to a simple narrative structure of suicide in which he makes one sad mistake. Next thing you know that he's Joseph the gypsy boy, adding an air of further social exclusion to the whole story, and the flowers appear on his grave, and you can forecast the winner of the derby, whether it's going to be a Newmarket horse or not, by looking at the flowers. Yeah, you begin to see how the folk imagination works here. It's all done in very, very brightly coloured outlines. There are stock characters. Morgan's grave at Lyme Regis is the grave of a sheep stealer. Because sheep stealers have their own set of folk narrative involving the hangman's stone, so we just kind of, sheep stealers, shepherds, it will all do. On the other hand, he might possibly have been a pirate because he's called Morgan, or a deserting sailor who killed himself because he couldn't get back to his boat on time. And highwaymen. Now, of course, the great thing about highwaymen is they do actually die by the roadside. Clibborn's Post in Hertfordshire is placed up on the location where James Clibborn died. He was originally a pie maker who turned highwayman, but unfortunately not having checked out that skills that had been developed in the pastry and delicatessen trade were really transferable. And the first person whom he tried to hold up shot him back. And again, a lot of these stories, everything happens in the same place. Perhaps this is another kind of folk theme. Where he died, there he was buried. An awful lot of stories developed on the suicide theme say, well, it was where he hanged himself from the tree, not he strung himself up in his barn, which is, of course, what actually historically happens, and he dropped down more or less from the tree into his grave, and that's where he's buried. Clibborn's Post, better still, was put up after it. Okay, now the post is genuinely, a bit like a roadway sign. It's not a stake, but it's performing the imaginative function of the stake. In fact, the great thing about these stakes is that any given stake, as in the real, genuine piece of wood that the kids used to play I'm the King of the Castle on, in the developed imagination turns into a tree. Okay, so you've got that motif from the saint's life, that, he banged his own staff, Joseph of Arimathea and all those guys, and it turned into a tree. The same thing is said about the stake which is buried through the suicide's heart, that, that tree by the roadside is the exact stake. And you kind of look at it and you go, Lush's bush in Norfolk, it's a willow. Have you ever tried? No, you haven't ever tried staking somebody through the heart with a bit of willow. But you know what I mean, willow is very difficult stuff to do this with. Obviously, like the willow tree comes first, and the story comes afterwards. So Clibborn's Post then becomes mysteriously identified with the stake, but also, for heaven's sake, don't move it or he'll come back again. Now this fascinates me because, as I say, this has all re-evolved. Two things have happened. One is that the stake has become, as it was in the medieval material, a magical tool that stops the ghost from walking. And the other is that we've moved away with a lot of these stories. We're not any longer talking about suicide, but about capital crimes, both of which were there in the medieval material, both of which we know from the abundant evidence had disappeared in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and both of which in the folk material 1823 onwards, resurfaced. Now, I don't think there's a secret underground river of, people nudging each other and passing on an oral tradition from the 14th century. I think what's happening is that there are imaginative connections which people will instinctively make, which were lurking there in the secularized version of the ritual, and which, when the physical actuality of suicide burial rituals was taken away, suddenly became popular again because they were great things to talk about. So the final stage you've got then is when the grave becomes not just a place of memory. I mean, what usually survives is the name. Stephen's grave, back to Dartmoor again, going up onto the moors. It's one of the first, obviously they kind of went up onto the moor as outcast as they could, whilst remaining conveniently accessible from Peter Tavy, and bury him at the crossing of two pathways. Well and good. The story survives. People actually remembered he was a guy. In fact, in this case, it was his girlfriend who was unfaithful, so he poisoned her with a bowl of porridge, and then went out and fed the pigs, and then went back in and repented and ate the other half of the porridge himself. And they bury him, and he comes again, as any good Devon ghost does, and he's laid by 12 parsons in a circle. All of the ghost exorcism tropes are applied to what's basically a historical narrative. And the ghosts themselves then begin to move on from association with the actual people. I mean, a lot of these later stories, they've got the name, and they know they need to do something with it. Mary Hunt's grave, okay, that's as factual as you can get. Who was Mary Hunt? Somerset tradition tells you that she was a witch. Or she might possibly have been a prostitute. Or maybe she was a woman who murdered her husband. On the other hand, she might have been a girl who got married and then, tragically didn't last her first pregnancy. Anything will do, as long as they're giving it that favour of female exclusion, which is basically just built on top of the name. And what does she do now? Why, she appears at Mary Hunt's grave. At midnight, rattling her chains, that venerable classical motif, which carries on into 19th century English folklore. Or possibly knitting, because she's a girl, you see, so what's she going to do for her afterlife? Or riding a go-kart. I don't know about the go-kart. I prefer that one. Yet, at the same time, you've either got people who are associated with an imaginary, if you like, personal identity as a dead one, or you've got something like Cowley's Corner in Oxfordshire, which was well known for having a man wearing, it's described as a shepherd's foul-weather coat, which I think is like what they had before they had barbers in Oxfordshire. With a broad-brim hat, who disappeared into a field, and then when you look later on, there was nothing there. Classic motif. Or he's a flash of lightning, or he's a sinister-looking calf or sheep, which disappears. So you realise, that was no ordinary sheep. At Godolphin in Cornwall, the tree from which the Jewish peddler hanged himself is pointed out on Jews Lane Corner, and it is a bad place to go. And then when you are there, he will appear in the likelihood of a bull with a fiery chariot. At Inkborough in Worcestershire, the Salter Street crossroads, where Joseph Matthews is known, 1775, an awful lot of these, when you do the local history research and when you kind of hit the parish registers, you will find the actual suicide, for once, I'll use a trope and say the factual kernel from which the development of legend has taken place. Well, that's all right, except that he doesn't come back looking anything like a bloke in 1775. He comes back as a flapping sheet. And those who are familiar with the ghost chronicles of the Monk of Byland will immediately recognise this as a medieval ghost. So, in fact, at this kind of underground level of English folk tradition, I think this is actually a continuous tradition, not a rediscovery. The ghost that happens where a person died or was buried is not the ghost of that person. It's a supernatural something. You've buried an outsider. You've kind of knocked a liminal hole between two worlds at a crossroads on the parish boundary. And through that hole, all sorts of otherworldly things might come back again, especially if you call them. Back to legend tripping, another, topic from our beginning address. The great thing to do is to go out there and actually make the ghost happen. So at Nethercompton, on the hills above North Dorset, Tucker's grave, we know who Tucker was. We know all about him, actually. He was another 60-year-old, well known locally to have a bad character, strung himself up in the bakehouse, so, hygiene regulations not even allowed, is buried at a crossroads, in a sense, you're channeling here the negative language of the parish guides, of the registers and everything. You can't get at people's internality from this. It isn't that kind of genre. He is, by the way that they treat him, reduced to a name and a place. And even that becomes unknown. So what happened is the local kids had this custom in which they'd all troop up there in the darkness. They would then sort of form a little ring and run around shouting, "Tucker, Tucker, come out, Tucker," giggle frantically, running back down the hill, not knowing why. It's legend tripping without even the legend. And it's only later on that you begin to realise that that was how it happened. This is how this thing has been put together. So that with these suicides, you tread on careful ground, if you like, here, because it all takes its rise in fact. This is not pure imagination. This is using genuine tragedy as a basis on which to build narrative superstructures. What I find fascinating is that whereas the medieval sources, so far as we can get to them, and of course by definition they're describing fairly elite or clerical people, displayed sympathy. Sleepless Souls is the title of a great medieval study of this. The sympathy freezes once you get to the hostile environment of the 16th century. It's not just the Reformation, it's a world in which a small elite of people are controlling parish government, and are actually much more concerned now to police the thoughts and the behaviours of those around them. So they adopt a raft of medieval beliefs, and they turn it into what I suspect is firstly a doctrine of suppression of, if you like, individuality. This individuality involves defying the basic laws of Christianity, so you can see where they're coming from. And they impose it visibly and obviously on their neighbours. In fact, the way suicides are treated, it's only selected people, it's not everybody who kills themselves that gets a fellow to say verdict, but the outstanding ones do, is exactly analogous to the way that victims of executive capital justice are handled. The classic logic of those terrible statutes that made so many things a capital crime was not that you killed everybody who stole goods of a value of more than 12p. You killed the ones who stuck out. So there would be a few exemplary hangings, and that put the fear of God and the state into people. And this whole language is then internalized by the crowd, who also want exemplary bad people of whatever character, typically the combination murderer plus suicide, who of course commits suicide precisely because he's afraid of the crowd, gets the treatment. Until 1823, when the government, under the process of an increasing idea of what constitutes civilization, crushes it. And then within about 1820, 1860, as I say, the Kitty J legends start, the folk imagination, not continuing ancient traditions so much as drawing out the material of ancient tradition that was there, that had been kind of boiled down, that was capable of being reconstituted from fact into myth, creates this whole nervous, ghost-ridden, tragic, slightly pitying, but definitely ghoulish set of narratives around the folkloric suicide burial. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. That was great. We are going to stop. We're going to run into lunch a little bit, just because I know that you want to ask these two guys questions. Can we stick to just a couple of questions each, if that, and then we can all go to lunch, and then there's the session starting again at 1 this afternoon. So let's... Yes, of course, it's 1 now, isn't it? Starting at 2. So are there any questions for Stuart or Jeremy?
Hiya. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. It was really interesting seeing those two presentations side by side, and it made me really curious about a possible connection between them in the idea of stakeholders. And I wonder if this idea of like the stake as an object used for vanquishing vampires, but it also is something that has meaning in legal geographies. So like a landscape as something that you have rights over, or you have ownership over, or you can stake out as a territory, or you have rights pertaining to decisions around it. That seems like a weird idea that connects your papers. So I wondered if either of you had any insights on that idea of if we don't know what stake is and it means these different things, what are stakeholders, or who are the stakeholders, holders of the stake?
You're the geographer, man.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is, I suppose, I sort of this was a question for you because of the stakes issue.
Yeah.
But yeah, I suppose it's a difficult one. I mean, certainly where I was coming from, I mean, the whole character of the landscape changes as a result of sort of changes in who has a stake in land, basically. And so early medieval period, it's, I guess, the church and sort of local communities who are sort of put there by, you know, the biological need to dispose of the dead, if you will. But then you have this kind of evolution in the 19th and early 20th centuries, where, as sort of folklore and law of the land sort of start intersecting more. So I'm not sure I'm not answering your question. What was the specific?
Oh, I'm just interested to know what the origin of different meanings of stakeholders, which is another kind of part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sort of
Well,
top down versus bottom up. Yes.
Interestingly, there are actual physical stakes used marking out pathways. This is back to the early medieval road system, which isn't very obvious. You also get mythologized stakes where people navigate by the gibbet. It's a very big 18th century thing. It's like, go up onto the downs and turn left at the gibbet. Gloriously, where I'm from in Epsom, they converted it because it ceased to be simply a landmark, but it became the place where you actually did the gambling. So you staked your bets, and I think this is where the word comes from, underneath the stake, which was also the gibbet of the guy who obviously had been a highwayman and hanged because he couldn't meet his debts because he'd incurred them and being at the stake. It's a feedback loop. There is a whole lot of medieval stuff to be done on roads, which is specifically looking at these words that you find. There are relations there. In particular, there's a whole set of pathways that refer to there being a stapole, which is clearly some kind of a thing that you see and make your way towards. But in Beowulf, which we're getting in a moment, the stapole is actually the thing under which Hrothgar stands and addresses his men. So it becomes a place of address. There's a whole other talk in this.
And should we have just one more question before lunch?
Hello. I had a question for Stuart. It seems to me that it's quite difficult to tell the story of the countryside in England without talking about enclosure and the loss of the commons. And is this something that you came across in your research?
Absolutely. Sorry, I can't see where you are. Oh, yes. Totally. So, yes, I mean, the Acts of Enclosure really kind of shut off, certainly from the perspective of corpse roads, shut off a lot of the direct routes. And then as the kind of the metal road system evolves, a lot of them just went out of use. But yeah, I mean, this, I think what we saw, and that idea of that exchange in folklore from 1925 sort of showed this idea that pathways for vital purposes, like transporting the dead, were kind of bolted on to field boundaries, which were themselves a result of the enclosures. So I think I suspect this is a kind of attempt at a sort of compromise in the face of encroaching sort of field systems and the privatization of land from the 15th century onwards, basically. So yes, it is absolutely key. And there's actually a wonderful book called by Nick Haynes called Trespass, which just came out this year, which looks at the history of this and the kind of the relationship between what some people call trespassing and the legitimate use of land, because it is a use that land is needed for. So that would be a book I'd recommend.
Thank you very, very much to both of our speakers. Thank you again for the Q&A.